Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. Jesus knew the power of stories to touch people's hearts, so he used parables to teach his followers about the kingdom of God. If you want to know God better, the keys are in the parables. The book we're about to talk about provides short studies on every parable in the Bible. You'll learn what God wants us to know from the prodigal son, the good Samaritan, the lost sheep, the talents, the sower, and many more. Each story includes a summary of the parable, the scriptural reference where it can be found, information on the historical and cultural setting, and key points. At the end of each study are questions that open the door to discussion, reflection, or further investigation, and help you to get to the heart of the parable. It's a wonderful tool for small groups or to add variety to your personal devotions. It's the desire of its author to let these studies draw you nearer to God as they enhance your understanding of His Word. Dr. William Marty taught at Moody Bible Institute for 37 years. His main emphasis was teaching an Old and New Testament survey to freshmen at the Chicago campus, and the fruit of his focus on teaching the storyline of the Bible was published in The Whole Bible Story. Dr. Marty has also written The World of Jesus and the Jesus Story and co-authored a quick start guide to the whole Bible. Joining us now to talk about his new book, Fascinating Bible Studies on Every Parable, is Dr. William Marty. Dr. Marty, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Good morning. It's a privilege to be with you, Rabbi Walker.
I love the parables. I grew up learning parables as a child, being taught by my rabbis, and for 44 years as a part of the traditional synagogue. It was a method that was used to convey questions. It was to prompt this art of asking questions. You know, Jesus said to his disciples, "Do you understand what I'm saying?" And they said they did, but later on they would come to him and say, "Listen, you know, we
I'm not sure they were totally honest when they said, "Yeah, we understand everything."
Yeah, but in private, they came to him and said, "You know, so we heard this, but what does it mean?" And that's where we heard some of the expressions of this sweet, loving Jesus. "Are you so dull? How long will I put up with you? You've just missed the point." One of the foundational principles that you introduce in the book, and I want to pursue it with you as we study this, is the rightful interpretation or the rightful analysis of Scripture, and the approach that is the one that is most revelatory. You cover in the introduction of the book, and that is the contextual evaluation of the environment in which the message was conveyed. Can you expand on that a little bit for our audience so they understand this whole principle?
Right. I think one of the main principles to keep in mind is that parables are not allegories. I heard a speaker recently talking about one of the parables, and he was allegorizing all the details of the story. But parables typically make one main point. Now, one contemporary writer, Craig Blomberg, says that there can be more than one main point, and it's related to the number of characters in the story. So the first guideline that I would emphasize in interpreting a parable is that you don't try to find meaning in all of the details. You look for the main point. And then, as you mentioned, the historical and cultural context is important. So secondly, I encourage people to look at the occasion for the parable. Was Jesus responding to his disciples when, he said, "Lord," when they said, "Ask, Lord, teach us to pray"? Or was he responding to religious leaders who criticized him for associating with people they despised? Or was he teaching truths about the kingdom, as he does in Matthew 13, and uses a whole series of parables there? So you need to look at the immediate context and determine what was Jesus' purpose in telling the story. And then because parables are designed, as you well know, since they use this method in the synagogue, to draw us into the story by identifying with the characters in the story. And I think that's one of the primary strengths of a parable or a story. We become caught up in the drama of the story. And then there's always an unusual turn, an unexpected twist to the story, to a parable. Like in Jesus teaching about, you know, when you're invited to a banquet, don't take the best seats, take the lowest seats, and then you'll be invited to come up to the best seats. And then he says the first will be last. Well, that would have been totally unexpected in telling a story about a banquet. And then finally, because as you mentioned, parables are intended to change the way we think and act, we need to always ask, how does this apply to me? How does this change my thinking? And even more than that, how's it going to change the way I live? How am I going to respond to Jesus? I was reviewing I just give a little personal testimony, and I was reviewing about the servant who did exactly what his master expected him to do. And the point in that story is that God doesn't owe us anything, that anything that he gives us is because of his goodness and because of his grace. And I did give a little personal testimony in the book. I said, after I retired, I had some issues and so forth that I didn't have when I was teaching. And I thought, why is God doing this to me? And as I reviewed that parable, I realized God doesn't really owe me anything. Anything that he gives me is because of his goodness and his amazing grace.
In the setting that we're looking at, the audience that Jesus is talking to, is this primarily a Jewish audience? Does the audience change as there becomes, like the mixed multitude in the Exodus, there becomes more Gentiles coming to hear or listen in? In the temple, they were relegated to the court of the Gentiles, but Jesus was not giving parables in the temple, so they weren't excluded from hearing or bearing witness to. But is the framework of the parables to the primarily Jewish audience that he was surrounded by?
I would say yes to that answer, because Jesus was ministering in Israel, and he was ministering in a Jewish culture. And some of his parables were for large crowds, like the parable of the sower and the wheat and the tares. But they were all Jews. It was a Jewish audience. And then some of the parables were for his disciples. We talked a little bit before we came on air about the fact that the disciples didn't always understand what Jesus was teaching, even though they said they did. So he would explain it to them, but they were all Jews. All of his disciples were Jews. And then the religious leaders, of course, were all Jewish. And so some of his parables were in response to their criticism. But in his parables, he did indicate that God's kingdom program, his grand plan of redemption, included people other than the Jews. And so particularly in Luke, who was a Gentile, but he wasn't one of Jesus' disciples, he emphasizes the theme of reversal. So it turns out in some of the parables that the Jews who expected that they would be blessed by God in the kingdom are shut out, and the people that they despised are the ones who gain entrance into the kingdom. But to answer your question, his audience was probably not exclusively, but primarily Jewish.
You made an interesting point when you opened with the parable of the first shall be last and the last shall be first. it's my nature to look for the interconnection of patterns of God and how they're exemplified. And it's kind of interesting in the analysis of the 40 years in the wilderness as they erected and disassembled and reassembled the tabernacle. It was in that exact order. The first would be last. So the first in the construction of the tabernacle would be the ones laying the foundation, and the last would be the ones putting on the roof.
Yes.
But in the disassembly, in the moving, the last would be first. They'd remove the roof first.
Oh,
and then
great analogy.
Right. So then as they traveled, it would then reverse again. The first would be last, the last would be first, and this would continue and did for 30 odd sometimes in the course of one 24-hour period, sometimes for many months. And so as I looked at this, because we have to establish the fact there was no New Testament at the time of Jesus. So his points of reference were always based on, I only say what I heard my father say, and I only do what I saw my father do. And so as we search for where his father might have said it, where his father might have done it, and look for the interconnection into the message, I spend a great deal of time looking back so that I can look forward in painting a complete portrait. In your study and in teaching of the parables, did you find that there were themes and that more than one parable fell into a specific thematic messaging, that as God did many times, he repeated, and he repeated it in different ways where unless you were a student, you wouldn't connect them. You would think it was different. But if you studied, you would see it really was the same message. It was just being framed differently because of the context, the times, the audience, and its application to then, as well as its then fast forwarding to, well, what does that mean to me today? Mm-hmm. So did you find that there were clusters, groups, or interconnection between the parables, or were they really standalone messages?
No, I think that's an excellent question, by the way. And if I do a revision of the book, that might be something to include in it. I think there are themes. I think the greatest theme, and this would be true probably of the whole New Testament, is God's grace and his love. And you see it in the parable that I just referred to previously, the unworthy servant who did exactly what his master expected him to do, but his master didn't even thank him. And that's because God doesn't owe us anything. But then you also see God's grace in the three parables in Luke chapter 15, the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and then the prodigal son. And all those parables emphasize God's love and grace for that which is lost. And the other theme that I think runs through the parables, particularly in the Gospel of Luke, is this theme that I mentioned previously of reversal. The Jews, usually Jesus is referring to the religious leaders, but it could refer to anyone who expect to be blessed are not blessed because they're relying on their own effort or their popularity or their prestige. But it's the people who humble themselves and are repentant that God blesses. So there's the theme of grace, there's the theme of reversal, and then I think there's several parables, again, mostly in Luke, that emphasize the high cost of following Jesus. We're all familiar with, Jesus teaching to take up your cross and follow him. And he tells the parable about man's going to build a tower, but he didn't have enough resources to finish it, and a king is going to war. He didn't evaluate the strength of the other army, and so Jesus is emphasizing that if we're going to be a true, genuine, fruitful follower of Christ, we need to carefully think about what it's going to cost us, because even though God is gracious and loving, there are demands of discipleship. Does that help answer your question to
Well,
some extent?
it does. I think there's an underlying theme of personal responsibility and personal accountability, driving it down to not a nation. And we kind of see that in the ministry of Jesus. The only nation in the Bible to ever have been saved was Nineveh. We have an expectation that Israel will be the next nation to be saved. Paul says, and all Israel will be saved.
Yeah.
We're looking forward to that. But in between Nineveh and the future salvation of Israel, national salvation is not a common practice. So we know that Jesus came and brought the individual redemption, personal responsibility, personal decision and relationship. And in the parables, he gives us characters, and we need to assess who we are in that story. Am I the one that's afraid of my master, and I don't do anything with the talent? I don't even put it in the bank. Or am I the one that goes out and brings that greater return? A personal analysis. Of particular interest to me is the parable of the sheep and the goats.
Yes.
And it's of particular interest to me because I believe that this is one of the parables that is talking to a body of believers, that both the sheep and the goats are believers, believers in Jesus as the Messiah. And there's discussion about whatever you do to the least of my brothers and sisters, you do to me. And it requires us to begin to kind of probe into a description of who was he referring to? Was he referring to the Jewish people? And is there a time that will come, as he says, when you will say, Lord, Lord, we cast out demons, we did all these things, and he says, depart from me, I never knew you. Is there a correlation? Is there a connection there that the treatment of the Jews, the treatment of his brothers, physical, natural lineage of his Jewish identity as the Jewish Messiah, and looking at what he knew had happened to Israel, what he came for, which he states twice, was once to the woman, I didn't come for you, I came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And when he sent the disciples out for the first time, he said, don't go to the Gentiles, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So is there a correlation there as we look at today? Looking at 2,000 years of a rather, let's say, jauntist view of how Christianity has treated Israel and the Jewish people. Is that relevant to that particular parable?
Yes, you're very perceptive, Rabbi Walker. I think in the context in which Jesus told the parable, that the least of these was probably referring to his disciples. That seems to be an expression that Jesus uses that's recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, which was, as you know, is probably the most Jewish of the Gospels. But then then by extension, it would apply to those who became followers of Jesus. And so we see this sort of uh, played out in the book of Acts and the growth of the early church, that the early believers were often persecuted. And so they were treated poorly. Now, you don't earn your salvation by the way you treat other people, but the way you treat other people, particularly the Jews, is evidence of genuine faith. And I think then, though, in the immediate context, it referred to Jesus' disciples, who were all Jews. By extension, it would have referred to the Jewish people in the early church. There was a lot of animosity between Jews and Gentiles initially. And then that has, I think, continued through the centuries, as you probably are more aware of than I am, since I'm a Gentile. But I think the application for us today would certainly apply to, if our faith is genuine, then we need to have compassion for all people, but particularly for the least of these. And the least of these would refer to Jewish people. And by the way, when Jesus says the least of these, he's not demeaning the worth of a person, because everyone is valuable in God's sight. He's talking about mainly their ethnic and social standing. That makes sense.
That makes complete sense. uh, in your introduction, you talk about parables often contain secrets or mysteries. Um, a good friend of mine, Dr. Michael Heiser, I don't know if you know of his work, but he's made a statement and said that if it seems strange or odd in Scripture, it must be really important.
Right. I'll have to remember that.
So that's been a part of his ministry, is really digging into the odd and the strange, and really pursuing that to illuminate it, because there's a lot of things that jump out at you and you say, well, that's a head scratcher. That one, I'm going to put that on my list to ask God when I get there, because
first thing I'm going to ask Jesus when I get there.
Exactly. So in these secrets and mysteries, there are keys and clues to unlocking the mystery that's contained within the parable. And so, although the parable itself is framed in such a way that it is exemplifying a particular point, hidden within that parable is also the key to unlocking the mystery within that parable. Otherwise, people would just walk away and say, well, that was really a great story, I just don't get it. So how do we, for lack of a better word, decipher the hidden meanings within the parables? Was there a universal method that he used to hide the key? Like once I figured out, like the game of Clue. It was Colonel Mustard in the library with a knife. Can we unlock the mystery of these parables using a particular key, or is there a different key for each one?
Well, I think I would say yes and no. The term mystery, as used by Jesus in his parables, is a reference not to a crime scene where it's a mystery who committed murder, but rather it refers to the revealing of new truth that was not known in the Old Testament, and it's truth that could not be known unless God revealed it. For example, you have in Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream a revelation that Daniel receives from God. And so what was a mystery to the king was revealed to him through Daniel, who received this revelation, the revelation of the mystery to from God. And so when Jesus says, "I speak," I'm speaking to people in mysteries. He's talking about the fact that there are new truths in these parables that were not fully known in the Old Testament. I wouldn't say that the truth wasn't there, but it wasn't fully known in the Old Testament, and it would not have been known if Jesus had not revealed it. It was a revelation from God, from Jesus, who was God. For example, in the parable of the sower, which is the first parable that Jesus taught, he talks about the sower who throws seed all over the place. Some of it doesn't grow at all, so in hard-packed soil, and then others, it grows a little bit, but it really doesn't bring a harvest. But there is some seed that brings a harvest. Well, that's good news and bad news. It was bad news because the Jews thought that when God inaugurated the kingdom, that everyone would be in the kingdom, and the people who weren't would be excluded, and they would go into judgment. But Jesus says, no, not everyone is going to respond to the good news about the kingdom, but some will. And then there's this harvest of 30, 60, and so forth. And it's amazing. Any amount of harvest like that would have been considered miraculous. Well, that was a new truth that wasn't fully known by the Jews from the Old Testament. The same with the parable of the wheat and weeds. The weeds, evil people, grow together with the wheat. And of course, when Jesus comes a second time, then he's going to fully implement the kingdom, and all of those promises and expectations from the Old Testament will be fully realized. But in this interim between his first and second coming, there was a little different implementation of the kingdom than what the Jews expected, and these differences are called mysteries. And he says, if you have ears to hear, eyes to see and ears to hear, then you'll get it. But if you really are hard-hearted and you don't want to see and you don't want to hear, then you won't get it. But I think the key, to answer your question, is that we need to have receptive hearts.
So being open to fully exploring the message in biblical context as to the kingdom was then as he walked among them, but he was both for then and for now as we begin to apply this. I think we've done a lot of drifting away from this. In particular, the Good Samaritan is quite a commentary on the religious establishment, quite a commentary on those who think too highly of themselves and are too self-important. He tackles the issue of pride and the issue of the busyness and what's really important. And then he picks someone who is virtually a half-breed, half Jewish and half not, and is rejected as being considered to be quote unquote unclean, so is not access to the temple. And yet he not only gives a parable, but he has a conversation which begins the first revival in his ministry, where
with the woman at the well,
right,
yeah.
Where a city comes to faith at the voice of a woman. So it's kind of interesting that future theologies or doctrines address women differently. The first revival was birthed out of the mouth of a Samaritan woman, and yet he...
Very perceptive. I never thought of it like that, but you're absolutely right. That's good. Very good, Rabbi Walker.
So to say that a woman has no place kind of goes a little bit against the practice of Jesus. Uh, just as a side note, Paul, I believe, was addressing particular women in particular situations and not creating a doctrinal statement about all women and all
Right.
voices, since Jesus not only spoke to the woman, uh, but the kind of woman she was, and then this parable of another Samaritan really opens up the door to what will ultimately become this lowering of a sheet of unclean animals to Peter, and God proclaiming what I proclaim is clean. And then that begs the question, was he also saying not only were the Gentiles clean, but was he also declaring women who were in a category of unclean in traditional orthodoxy? Was he now proclaiming them clean as well in this declaration of what he says is clean? And then Paul goes on to say, now there is no Jew or Greek, there is no male or female. Is that the evidence and supported by God's proclamation? So we have Jesus weaving the Samaritan into the narrative on more than one occasion, but in particular edifying the Samaritan and attributing to him certain attributes of kindness, of consideration, of provision, of being much more of an ambassador of what Jesus would expect one of his followers to be, and that is to go the extra mile, to make provision.
In many of his parables, the hero or the heroine was a woman, like the sinful woman who washed Jesus' feet with her tears, and in the three parables in Luke chapter 15, the first one was about a shepherd, the second one is about a woman who lost a coin, and then to sort of emphasize your point, after Peter had the vision that indicated he shouldn't call anything unclean or impure, because God has declared everything as clean. So when Paul goes to Philippi, where does he go? He goes to the place of prayer, and he speaks to women, and who becomes a prominent believer? Lydia, a woman. So yeah, you're right, and Jesus sort of lit the fire in his teaching and in his ministry for a much bigger ministry than what the Jews, even his disciples, would have anticipated.
I'm glad we're having this conversation, especially in light of the parables, because the mystery of the parables are that what would be considered to be common, normal, traditional, and within the construct of first century Judaism, he is giving examples which poke holes in the lifestyle and in the treatment of your fellow man, regardless of their station. And this is a message that's carried all the way through the New Testament, all the way into the Revelation chapter 2, where he chastises the church at Ephesus, and he said, look, I've seen your great works, but look at the heights from which you've fallen. You've forsaken your first love, the Holy Spirit. And he goes on to judge the performance, because they were all about works. It wasn't about faith. The construct of faith without works is death, is certainly exemplified in the parables. You can't just be a reader of the word, you have to be a doer of the word. And he certainly supports the follow-on text that are all really rest on the parables. So they're more of an expository teaching than many, I think, would credit that the New Testament that followed the four Gospels and the giving of the parables are really expository teachings on the parables.
Yeah, again, I commend you. That's very perceptive. We don't have a lot of direct quotes or even direct references to Jesus' ministry in the epistles, but just as you mentioned, what Jesus taught in the parables and what he exemplified in his life are truths that are elaborated on in the epistles.
We're talking with Dr. William Marty, author of the new book, Fascinating Bible Studies of Every Parable. As you can see, the parables are not just Aesop's fables and cute and cute stories. They contain messages of truth, of which the foundation of our faith walk are being laid out for us in examples that, if we weigh into those examples, we become more cognizant of the hierarchy in which Jesus sees man treating man and man honoring God. And this is an outstanding study. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to dig in a couple more of the parables and unlock some of these mysteries so that you can feel ignited to say, hey, let me go back and read them again with this by my side as a study guide so that I can really see and hear and understand what was being conveyed, not only for then, but for now. We'll be right back. Shalom. I'm Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, inviting you to join me and my special featured guests twice per month with Rabbi Zeb Parat and Carl Gallups, and monthly with Dr. Michael Heiser, Dr. Michael Lake, Dr. Timothy Jennings, Dr. Mark Baker, Dr. Jeffrey Johnson, Drs. Michelle and Mark Sherwood, Dr. Kim Moss, Derek Gilbert, Peter Rosenberger, Brandon Gallups, Steve Fair, Stephen Black, and Sean Tabbitt for in-depth insights into Israel, prophecy, the unseen realm, the brain, spiritual warfare, overcoming shame, mysteries of the Bible, prophetic insights, the sensational and the supernatural, caregiving, addiction recovery, understanding the divided heart, same-sex attraction, and much more. We're proud to feature some of the greatest biblical minds from both Israel and around the United States. Check out our featured guest lineup and 24/7 feed on ignitinganation.com or watch by topic on any device with our free apps. If you can't find what you need, you're just not looking in the right place. Follow us on social media and download our free apps today.
With today's smartphone technology, news, information, sports, and entertainment is widely available and almost unbounded. But what about the information that believers in Yeshua are looking for? Well, now there's an app for that. Igniting a Nation now has apps available for Android and iPhone. With our app, you'll gain access to everything you would in our website, from our featured guests to our live streaming shows. Visit Google Play or the Apple Store and download Igniting a Nation's new app today.
Shalom. I'm Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, inviting you to join me and Israel's #1 rated guide, Edo Canaan, for our annual Israel trip. Our 2022 trip is now open for registration for our 18th trip to Israel. Our trip will take us from Tel Aviv to the Galilee, down to the Dead Sea, and 4 nights in Jerusalem. You will walk where Yeshua walked and watch the Bible turn from black and white to living color. Visit ignitinganation.com/events and download the registration form today. No, it's not too early to take advantage of our payment plan designed to fit any budget. All of our trips sell out, and we want you to experience this life-changing journey. Registration is now open for April 2nd to 13th, 2022, and we promise you, you will never read your Bible the same way again. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Dr. William Marty, author of a new book, Fascinating Bible Studies on Every Parable. Dr. Marty, welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth. One of the parables you discuss in the book is the rich man and the poor man. Actually, this was, you relate this to Nathan using a parable to confront David.
Yes.
Most people would be surprised to think about the Old Testament containing parables, seeming to assign that to a particular teaching style of Jesus, but that's not actually the case, is it?
No, and it's interesting that Nathan used a parable to confront David with his sin. And I think one of the reasons that he did it, and it's probably the same reason that Jesus used parables, is you get drawn into the story, and then when the speaker, in the case of Nathan, the prophet, makes his point, you feel it personally. The context, I think most of our listeners probably know, was David's sin with Bathsheba. And so instead of coming to him and pointing his finger directly at him and say, David, you've sinned, he told the story about a rich man and a poor man. A rich man exploited the poor man, and he asked David, what would you do to a rich man who took advantage of a poor man? And David said, well, I'd punish him. And Nathan said, you're the man. And David got the point.
Exactly. In your experience, what were some of your favorite parables and the lessons that you extracted or learned from them that became powerful to you?
The parables that I like the most and are the most challenging when I think about how I would apply them are the ones in Luke chapter 15 about the lost sheep, the lost coin, and then the lost son, or the prodigal son, because that challenges me to be sensitive to people who are lost. For years, for 37 years, I taught in a Bible college, and I didn't have a lot of interaction with unbelievers, and so it was a challenge for me to put myself in situations, outside of my comfort zone, where I could interact with unbelievers, and I still do that. This might be controversial for some people, but last weekend I performed a wedding for a couple who aren't believers, and they had been together for quite a while, but I met them through a triathlon, and they live here in Cortez, where I live, and so they decided to get married, and they asked me to marry them, and I did. And practically, I would guess that almost everybody at the wedding was an unbeliever. And of course, in the ceremony, I was able to include a word about God's view of marriage and that sort of thing. And so, I don't know. Who knows? Only God knows what kind of impact that will have on unbelievers. But I do that because of the story of the Good Shepherd, the woman, and the prodigal son, which, as I mentioned in my book, Barclay says it should really be the loving father, because he's the hero in the story, not the prodigal son. So those parables challenged me personally. And then the one that I think is the most challenging is the parable of the shrewd manager. There was an employer who found out that his business manager was cheating him, and he fired him. And so the manager called in his employer's debtors, and he reduced their debts by different amounts. And then when his employer found out what he did, instead of criticizing him, he commended him. And it's somewhat of a puzzle. Why would he commend this man for reducing debts? Was he creating further loss for the employer? And so that parable is a bit of a challenge. And would Jesus use a story about somebody who did something that was wrong to make a good point? And as I studied that parable, there are different views on it, I became convinced that what this manager was doing was reducing his commission. So he wasn't actually losing money for his employer, but he was giving up his commission in order to make things right. And I think, the point in that story is that you need to prepare for the future. And then Jesus also says, well, you can't love God and mammon, or you can't love God and money. You can't love two things. And obviously, the manager, when he reduced the debt by losing his commission, was an example of someone who didn't love money enough to try to selfishly hold on to it. So that parable was the most challenging one I studied. And then, as I mentioned previously,
I want to kind of inject something
I'm
here
sorry.
because I think it's important to note.
If you give me a chance.
Yeah, most people don't really understand the world and the life and times of Jesus, the temple construct, and actually who Matthew Levi was, and the role he played as a tax collector, operating basically the franchise at the gates as you paid to enter. He had committed to Rome, basically bid the contract and guaranteed them a certain amount. And then he would have his franchisees, if you will, who had guaranteed him a certain amount. And so if in the application, in the context of this scenario, if he were to allow them to cut someone's taxes to cut their commission, so that but yet still pay to Matthew the full amount, they would be righting their wrong. And so in context of the structure of tax collection and temple tax and all of that, this has a great deal of relevance in context, because this was a system of money.
That's a great illustration of that. I appreciate that. I agree. I never thought of that, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
So again, drawing on the context to bring understanding to a parable is really essential, that we do a little bit deeper study. It's interesting that so many people will, not so many, because unfortunately, statistically 80% of the body doesn't read the Bible. But if you are in that 20% category, and we hope that that's expanding because we're encouraging you to embrace some of the exciting aspects of messages you may not be hearing from the pulpit, that you may not be exploring in Bible study. And there are some very interesting aspects to Scripture that you would be encouraged to not only read the Bible, but read complementary text to the Bible, which doesn't canonize your work, but it gives us the opportunity to break further down our understanding. And often we need a study aid, we need a tool to help get us in the right direction, pointed in the right path, and you do a great job of that. And I wanted to
Thank you. I appreciate
that a point.
A couple of my friends are actually using this book to lead Bible studies, but a couple of them are using it personally. And one of them said, "I'm halfway through your book already," and they really appreciate the questions, because as you know, there are questions at the end of each chapter for personal application. And that's so the way that these people are using the book is exactly how I hoped it would be used.
When you embarked on this, what was, here you are, 37 years of teaching. This is a project you've done in retirement. What was it that made you want to tackle the parables?
Well, I had taught the life of Christ for years, and so I knew the life of Christ and very well, and I knew about Jesus' parables, but I had never had an opportunity to just study the parables. And so when Bethany asked me if I would consider writing this book on the parables, I leaped at the opportunity, because it's something that I always wanted to do. I didn't anticipate that it would be life-changing for me. I suppose I was a little bit like a Pharisee and thought, since I was a Bible teacher for so long and had a whole bunch of degrees, that I was fine. But I realized that I still needed to grow. I needed to learn, and I needed to make some changes, and I did. I made some adjustments in my own life as a result of studying and writing on these parables.
Well, that's exactly what the intention of them being inspired by God to be included in the scriptures is, that for us to be this new creation, to be this minister of reconciliation, to be this ambassador of God, we need to understand that we've been given the title. We have the little desk plate that says Minister of Reconciliation, Ambassador of God. We wear the little emblem. For many, it's a cross that says that's your State Department ambassadorship for the kingdom of heaven. But how well do we represent it, and how well can we give an answer for that 1 Peter 3:15 hope that we have? I think that a lot of that hope is found in the parables, because as Jesus commented on what was, he was also commenting on what was to come. And yes, as we look at the life application, your life has changed, my life has changed, and I want to encourage the audience that if you're looking for that transformational change and you haven't found it, just by reading the text, which many find that is sufficient, but you need to augment it with supportive documentation and study guides that you, or a small group that you're leading, or a Bible study that you're participating in. I highly recommend Dr. William Marty's book, Fascinating Bible Studies on Every Parable. You can visit ignitingnation.com and click on Dr. William Marty and a picture of this book, and it'll take you right to a place to purchase a copy for you. Dr. William Marty, thank you for sharing this with us here on Revealing the Truth. May God bless all the works of your hand. It's been an honor to have you with us today.
And it's been my privilege, Rabbi Walker. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
You're a man of God and a student of His Word.
Well, I thank you for that. I consider that high praise, and don't take it lightly. Thank you. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.